Hello, welcome to Season 5 of the Foresight Africa podcast. As always, I am your host, Landry Signé, Senior Fellow in the Brookings Institution's Global Economy and Development Program and Africa Growth Initiative. In today's episode, we will be discussing the World Bank and International Monetary Fund's 2026 spring meetings, which run from April 30th to April 17th. Every year, the meetings bring together leaders and experts from around the world to engage in debate, learning, and advocacy around the most pressing issues in the global economy. To understand more the state of the global economy and how African countries are looking to seize this moment to advance their agendas at the Bank and the International Monetary Fund, I am joined today by Regis N'Sonde, Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund, where he represents the interest of 17 African countries. Stay tuned after my conversation with ED Regis N'Sonde for insights into the World Bank's perspective ahead of the 2026 spring meetings. I also had the opportunity to speak with Harold Tavares, Executive Director of Africa Group 2, representing 23 African countries and former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister of Cabo Verde. Welcome, Executive Director Regis.
Thank you very much, Professor Signé. It's a pleasure to be with you today in the run-up to the spring meetings of IMF and World Bank.
Thank you for joining me today. From the perspective of the International Monetary Fund, what are the key global economic trends and risks that will define this year's spring meetings, Executive Director N'Sonde?
There is a lot going on in the world economy. First, key trend, I cannot not mention the debt vulnerabilities that are continuing. Many countries, whether advanced or emerging or even low-income countries, are facing increased debt vulnerabilities. This has been a long trend for the past few years. Some countries are facing solvency issues, but most countries are facing liquidity problems in servicing their debt. So this is a trend that is continuing, although there is improvement in the debt situation of some countries, but overall the debt vulnerability issues remain. A second key trend is economic fragmentation. You are aware of the tariffs war and the trade policies, including industrial policies that tend to slow down global trade. This is an important trend that we need to tackle as international financial community. And the IMF has a clear position on that. On this issue, the IMF promotes global trade in a fair and just manner. And in this regard, I think the collaboration between the IMF and other institutions, more specialized institutions such as the World Trade Organization, is very important to make sure that this trend is reversed. And of course, I will add a third key trend to the global economy, which is the increased use of artificial intelligence. This trend, of course, provides major opportunities for countries, notably in terms of productivity gains, but also present a few risks that also needs to be tackled. So I would say these are the three main trends going into these spring meetings of 2026.
Insightful. How are these global dynamics, particularly higher for longer interest rates, debt vulnerability, and slower global growth affecting African economies?
Well, many African economies are already being impacted. It is clear that not only those trends are providing, as I was saying, some opportunity for countries. Some countries enjoy important natural endowment. So the current situation in the Middle East that is bringing the price of commodities up is beneficial, at least on a temporary basis, to a number of economies, those that export minerals and natural resources, energy, oil. But it is an adverse impact, an adverse shock to those countries that are net importers of those commodities, including fertilizers. A number of countries have already started to feel the pain. I can say a country like Sao Tome and Principe, which is a net importer of energy, where energy is very expensive, is already feeling the pressure. So all African leaders, of course, should be aware of the challenges. The shock in the impact of the war in the Middle East is obviously a supply shock that increased the policy trade-offs between a fiscal policy and monetary policy. Central banks have significant policy trade-offs to meet. They need to, of course, maintain price stability without further damaging economic growth. So there is a important coordinations also to be made between fiscal policy and monetary policy to ensure that while the fight against inflation is going on, no adverse impact on economic activity should be neglected.
Insightful, Executive Director N'Sonde. Many African governments face difficult trade-offs between fiscal consolidation, growth, and social protection. Based on your engagement, what policy mixes are proving most effective in navigating these transitions?
Well, if there are policy trade-offs, it's because we don't have a sufficient macroeconomic policy space. So in order to create that needed space to meet both consolidation, fiscal consolidation needs and meeting the investment and social spendings that our countries require, there is a need to expand this fiscal space. First actions, and the policymakers are aware of this, it's important to enhance domestic revenue mobilization to create the necessary fiscal space. Now, this means that we need to expand the tax base. Our policymakers need to fight the tax exemptions. And on the other side, there is a need to, of course, rationalize spending while better targeting the needed investment and social spending for the most vulnerable countries. So this is where the main trade-off is. Of course, those countries in the current juncture of reduced ODA, there is a need for multilateral institutions to step up and be ready to meet the need of those countries, low-income countries especially. This is where development institutions such as the World Bank and regional institutions such as the African Development Bank are very important, very useful. For the IMF, as you know, the mandate of the IMF is a little bit different. The IMF helps countries ensure macroeconomic stability. In doing so, the IMF is ready to, of course, support the countries in this very challenging environment.
Amazing. Where have responses been most effective and where do gaps remain, Executive Director N'Sonde?
I think, generally speaking, I can say policy responses have been effective where the countries have benefited from the fund support. This is very important. Many of our countries, as you know, face a weak capacity, implementation capacity for reforms. And capacity development assistance from the IMF, from the World Bank alike are very important. It helps policymakers really own the reforms they implement. So the most effective outcomes, the most effective policies have been where the countries have benefited from technical assistance, capacity development, and where the ownership of reforms are strong.
Insightful. And what reforms or innovations are most needed within the IMF or across international financial institutions to better support African countries, particularly regarding debt restructuring, liquidity provision, and crisis prevention?
The IMF has quite a number of instruments available to support African countries. First, the lending facilities that the IMF has. There is plenty of those facilities, concessional resources that the IMF make available to low-income countries in need. There are also countries that are facilities that are less concessional. For mature stabilizers, a number of African countries have tapped into those less concessional resources. Of course, in order to benefit from those resources that are more abundant, the country needs to have a very strong fundamentals. And there is also what we call precautionary instrument that the countries can use. So far, those precautionary instruments have been used by emerging markets, but we will hope that the IMF will expand the use of these resources for lower income countries as long as those countries really benefit from very strong fundamentals. Now, the IMF also is acting, as you know, on the debt front. The IMF participate in different initiatives, at least provide advice to creditors and debtors alike. The common framework under the G20 is one of them. And also the IMF is very active along with the World Bank in the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. There will be further discussion during the spring meeting on this roundtable, and the IMF continue to provide advice to both creditors and debtors to make sure that debt restructurings are effective. As you know, we have made significant gains in terms of timeliness, in terms of predictability of those debt restructuring processes, but needs to be done. More need to be done, and the IMF is working toward those objectives of making those debt restructuring processes more effective and more timely.
Fantastic. Executive Director N'Sonde, how can coordination between international financial institutions be improved to avoid fragmentation and maximize impact?
At the end of the day, it is the membership or member countries that act. But the IMF, the international institutions are here to help countries and provide advice. There are significant gains to be made in a more unified world where global trade is abundant. And we have seen that the global trade has slowed down following the tariff wars and the different industrial policies that some systemic countries have put in place. So the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization should continue to coordinate their actions. There are different platforms on which those institutions collaborate, and it's really important, extremely important to maintain these coordinations. I will add that those global institutions I just mentioned should also strengthen their collaboration with regional institutions that are closer to realities on the continent. The African Development Bank has a new president with new visions, clear visions on what he wants to do with 4 main objectives. And I think that he has shown, the new president of the African Development Bank has shown his interest in enhancing collaboration with the IMF. He has visited the IMF right after his election as president of the ADB. And we were honored to welcome him. When we say we, I mean African executive directors at the IMF, at the board. We welcome him and we had an exchange of visions and ideas. And I think there is good hope that those 2 institutions, IMF and African Development Bank, at least will be able to increase their collaboration for the benefits of our member countries.
Fantastic. If you were advising finance ministers and central bank governors ahead of the spring meetings, what will be your top actionable recommendations to accelerate inclusive growth, strengthening macroeconomic stability, and enhancing resiliency to future shocks?
Thank you very much for your very interesting question. Of course, African leaders are well aware of the policy they need to put into place. We have frequent exchange of views in this regard, and they know very well the IMF policy recommendations. In order, of course, to strengthen growth or growth prospect, the first precondition is to ensure that they maintain macroeconomic stability. And of course, they need to mobilize the necessary resources to boost the growth. So this means that they need to invest in human capital through education and social spending and health spending, which is extremely important to increase human capital and physical infrastructure. And of course, the continent can leapfrog from artificial intelligence, where they can make significant gains in productivity and therefore boost the growth prospect. Structural reforms, very important. Our policymakers needed to continue structural reforms to improve governance, to create the conducive business environment for attracting investors. And of course, if I have to add another policy recommendations, especially at this juncture, is to invite our policymakers on the continent to really advance our African continental free trade area, which is an important initiative where our economies can make significant trade, but also growth gains, especially in the current junctures. We have a diverse number of economies on the continent. Some of the economies can specialize or have specialized. They benefit from comparative advantage. Some are producers of natural resources. Others are turned into more services. And with that diverse landscape of economies, I think our countries, African countries, can benefit a lot from starting of these important regional trade initiatives.
Excellent advice and a great note for us to end on. Thank you, Executive Director Regis N'Sonde, as always, for your excellent insights. I look forward to hearing more about the International Monetary Fund's work during the spring meetings.
Thank you very much, Professor Signé. It was a real pleasure to join you. And in closing, I would like just really to commend you for your very helpful and very successful program. And I'm always pleased to be with you. Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you during the spring meetings.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the special collaboration. We deeply appreciate you. Turning now to Harold Tavares, Executive Director of Africa Group 2 at the World Bank, representing 23 African countries. Welcome, Harold.
Thank you, Professor. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me again, and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much for joining me today. As we approach the spring meetings, how do you assess the current state of the global economy, particularly in terms of growth fragmentation, interest rate, and debt dynamics?
Sure. As you know, Professor, the world is very different since we last spoke. The current global environment presents serious headwinds and challenge for African countries. There is an urgent need to protect the concession of finance, address debt vulnerability decisively, and prioritize investment that foster growth and job creation. As you know, job is our main agenda for the World Bank Group. And this spring meeting is still going to be the main discussion, and especially link that with the pillars that we discussed in the previous meeting, in the annual meeting, related to the infrastructures as energy and human capital to prevent today's shocks from becoming long-term development setbacks.
Fantastic. Following up on that, what are the most important implications for African economies in both the short and medium term?
I would say that on the short term, the African economy face higher borrowing costs in international markets and reduce access to to Eurobond financing, capital flowing out towards safer and high yield assets in developing markets. As a result, the governments either borrow domestically or turn to institutions like IMF and the World Bank. Also, debt servicing pressure intensify with a larger share of revenue going to interest payments. As you know, African countries pay really higher debts and they spend more money paying interest rates than investing in education or health. As a result, I would say fiscal tightening leads to cuts in spending and delays in infrastructure and social programs. But on the long term, I would say the high debts still in borrowing costs may push reforms. Debt will still be a major issue because this is something that we're tied for long term. I would say the better tax collection systems, reduce reliance on external debt. As you know, recently we have seen country cuts in foreign aid. This is mainly for the biggest donors, as you know, the US, the UK, France, and others. And I think this from our capitals, for our authorities, I think a more disciplined public spending too. This is from our side. I think it's very important that we take in consideration, if managed well, this could improve macroeconomic stability in the long term.
Fantastic. Over the past year, what have been the most consequential global shifts? For example, tightening financial institutions or the fragmentation, the climate shocks, among others. And how have they translated into policy trade-offs for African governments?
The central trade-off facing African governments is between stabilizing the economies today and investing in the future. This dilemma is especially pronounced in Sahel. And I want to bring Sahel here because this week we're going to approve the country partnership framework for the Sahel country. Very innovative initiative because we're planning to approve the CPF, the country partnership framework, as one for the four countries jointly, because they have all the similar challenge. And I think the challenge that they face, where government must balance urgent security and humanitarian needs with the long-term development goals. And I think the Sahel, it's a very unique region, and this is perfect to show you this type of the tightened financial condition and geopolitical fragmentation, climate shock. But with that, also, many governments have had to prioritize inflation control. And we know the current situation that we have in the Middle East. One of the biggest challenges for African countries, the impacts on this current situation is the inflation. But the inflation has been an issue for a long time. But I think the government needs to prioritize inflation control, exchange rates stability, and debt servicing, often at the expense of public investment, social service, and climate resilience. As I mentioned earlier, in the Sahel, this pressure are compounded by acute security challenge, frequent climate shocks with floodings and fragile institutions, forcing governments to allocate significant resource to crisis response rather than development.
Insightful. Where have responses been most effective and where do gaps remain?
There's a lot of success stories to be told, particularly from our continent. But obviously, we are still facing a lot of challenge. But the good stories we need to tell. And I always like to say that this is what the president of the World Bank said, whatever works best in one country, we don't need to invent, we just need to replicate it. And I'll give you a few examples where response has been most effective. First, Kenya. As you know, Kenya was on the news last year and the year before. I want to share this response that Kenya has done, which has taken relatively decisive steps in tightening monetary policy to stabilize inflation and the currency, increase tax and reduce fiscal deficit, and maintain engagement with IMF. As you know, protests in the street, mainly because of this main issue. And the other example Cote d'Ivoire has benefit from currency stability, maintain strong infrastructure-led growth, and avoid severe inflation spikes relative to peers. And the third example I would like to use is Zambia, which was under news too because of its debt challenge they had in the country. Zambia has been a key test case for sovereign debt resolution. And that was a big outcome for the G20, but also, like I said, the gaps remains significant. Nigeria, for example, we know the challenge that Nigeria had, particularly if you're familiar with macro finances in Nigeria regarding the subsidies. I would say Nigeria implemented major reforms. It removed full subsidies and liberalized parts of the foreign exchange system. However, the inflation surge, currency volatility persists, and social safety nets remain limited. Another example is Ghana. Ghana made progress under the IMF program with the domestic debt restructuring completed and fiscal consolidation is underway. But we know growth remains weak and private sector credits is constrained and confidence recovery is very slow. All of these we see a case of success, but still with a lot of gap. But we can use this as a knowledge and see what works in one country can be replicated. And all of this, we can replicate this knowledge around the continent.
Looking ahead, what are the top 2 to 3 actionable priorities African governments and your international partners should focus on to deliver better outcomes, whether in terms of growth, jobs, resiliencies, among others? And if possible, could you point to countries that exemplify successful approaches that others could learn from?
Let me structure this in 3 dimensions. The first most important thing when we talk about end the poverty, I think job is the most important thing. Put job creation at the center of the reforms and use my own experience as an African group too. Countries like Senegal and Cabo Verde show how jobs can be integrated into reform agenda. Let's look at Senegal. Senegal has combined regulatory reforms with the targeted investment in agribusiness, tourism, and service. While Ghana has focused on improving the business environment and skills to support SMEs. And Cabo Verde illustrates how tourism-led growth can pair that with the skill development, can generate employment as a small open economy. And mainly the elements they can show how job can be very impactful on the economy of the not only of those countries, but it can be a model for being replicated in other countries. Second, I would say mobilizing private capital at scale. Several of my countries demonstrate how clear policy can crowd in private investments. And one example is Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal. They have used public-private partnership and sector-focused strategy to attract private capital into energy, not only energy, but agro-processing and infrastructure. And the third one, I like to link this particularly with my other hat that I use, which is small states, and particularly crisis response, shift from crisis response to resilience. I use Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea, the example, which is to highlight the importance of tackling debt and climate risks together. As you might be familiar, Cote d'Ivoire had done a debt SWOT focus on education, but I want to use particular example Cote d'Ivoire effort to preserve fiscal space while sustaining public investments, underscore how macroeconomics stability support growth. Social spending. While Guinea, it has increasingly integrated climates and climate-related risks into agriculture and mining and infrastructure planning. This experience show that resilience requires upfront investment, but not just an emergent response. That means you're not only mitigated, but also you're adapting.
Excellent advice and a great note for us to end on. Thank you so much, Executive Director Harold, as always, for your excellent insight. I'm looking forward to hearing more about the World Bank's work during the spring meetings.
Thank you, Professor. It's always great to have this conversation with you. I look forward to see you at the meeting.
I am Landry Signé, and this has been Foresight Africa. Thank you, listeners, for joining me today. The Foresight Africa podcast is brought to you by the Brookings Podcast Network. Send your feedback and questions to podcasts@brookings.edu. My special thanks to the production team, including Ike Blake, supervising producer, Fred Duz, producer, Dafe Oputu, Izzy Taylor, Aisha House, and Sila Ilunga Reed, associate producers, Gaston Reboredo, audio engineer, and Daniel Morales and Teddy Wansik, video producers. The show's art was designed by Shaventi Mendes. Additional promotional support for this podcast comes from my colleagues in Brookings Global and the Office of Communications at Brookings.